Have you ever wondered how society truly treats its elders? The very people who once built our communities, raised families, and carried decades of wisdom are often reduced to shadows, ignored, or even ridiculed. This story will show you how one small act of courage from a boy no older than 10 changed everything inside a room filled with wealth, arrogance, and indifference. Stay with me until the end, because what happened in that upscale restaurant will move you and might even make you question how you treat others. And before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our powerful stories. It was a chilly Friday evening in downtown Chicago, the kind of night when the city's elite filled the most expensive restaurants to unwind from their week. Inside Le Grand Hall, a five-star dining spot known for its chandeliers, imported wines, and white glove service, the atmosphere radiated luxury. Waiters glided between tables carrying plates of filet mignon and lobster tails, their polished shoes clicking softly against marble floors. A pianist in the corner played smooth jazz that blended with the hum of conversation and the clink of fine crystal. The guests were a parade of expensive suits, designer dresses, and rehearsed smiles. For many, dining here wasn't just about food. It was a performance, a statement of power and belonging. In that world, every accessory, every laugh, even the choice of wine, was a silent measure of status. At one of the corner tables sat the Thompson family. Michael, a mid-level executive trying to impress his boss across the room. His wife, Caroline, composed and elegant, and their 10-year-old son, Ethan. Unlike his parents, Ethan wasn't distracted by the theatrics of the evening. His young eyes scanned the room with curiosity, not admiration. While the adults calculated prestige, Ethan seemed to search for something real. And then, the moment came. The glass doors at the entrance opened, and an old man stepped inside. His name was Walter, though no one in the restaurant knew that yet. He wore a threadbare coat, patched at the elbows, and shoes that had clearly walked many winters. His white hair was uncombed, his face lined with years of struggle. Compared to the polished crowd, he looked like he belonged to another world entirely. At first, silence swept across the room. Forks hovered mid-air, glasses paused at lips. Then came the whispers, the raised eyebrows, the concealed chuckles. A woman at a nearby table leaned toward her husband and muttered, "What is he doing here? Surely he's lost." Another man smirked. Maybe he wandered in thinking this was a soup kitchen. Walter ignored the stares as best he could. His steps were slow but determined. He had worked his whole life, construction, factory lines, odd jobs no one else wanted. Now, in the autumn of his years, widowed and alone, he decided that for one night he would sit down and enjoy a meal in dignity. He knew he didn't look like the others, but wasn't he human too? Didn't he deserve the same respect? He approached an empty table by the window and quietly asked a waiter if he could sit. The waiter hesitated, his smile strained, glancing toward the manager as if waiting for permission. After a pause that felt like judgment itself, he gestured reluctantly for Walter to sit. The old man lowered himself into the chair, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the menu. Around him, the murmurs grew louder. A group of young men in suits snickered. "Hope he brought enough change to cover the water," one said. The others laughed, loud enough for Walter to hear. He kept his head down, pretending to study the menu, though the words blurred through the sting of humiliation. From his corner, Ethan watched everything. Unlike the others, he didn't see a stranger who didn't belong. He saw an old man, tired, hungry, carrying a quiet dignity despite the mockery around him. Something inside the boy twisted. It wasn't just discomfort, it was anger. The kind of righteous anger children sometimes feel when they recognize unfairness that adults have long learned to ignore. Caroline noticed her son's stare and touched his arm. "Don't get involved, Ethan," she whispered. "It's not our business." But to Ethan it was. Every laugh that echoed across the restaurant felt like an insult thrown directly at him too. How could they all sit there, eating meals that cost more than some families made in a week, while treating a man like Walter as less than human. Meanwhile, Walter placed a simple order: soup and bread. Even that seemed to irritate the waiter, who set down the water glass with unnecessary force. Another wave of chuckles rippled across the room. Walter's shoulders sank. For a moment, he considered leaving, but his pride told him to stay. He deserved this meal, no matter what they thought. Ethan clenched his fists under the table. He remembered the lessons his mother used to tell him at bedtime. Respect isn't earned by money or clothes, but by kindness. Now, sitting in the heart of luxury, he realized how few believed that. The laughter grew louder, sharper, more cruel. One man said loudly enough for half the room to hear, "Careful, folks. Don't let him near the wine list. Might have to sell his shoes to pay for it." The table roared with laughter. That was it. Ethan could not sit still any longer. He pushed back his chair abruptly, the screech of wood against marble slicing through the noise. Every head turned. Michael, mortified, hissed, "Ethan, sit down right now!" But the boy didn't listen. His small frame walked steadily across the dining room, each step louder in the silence that followed. He reached Walter's table, pulled out the empty chair beside him, and sat down. The room froze. No one expected it. Walter looked up, startled. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. Ethan gave him a small, firm smile. "Do you mind if I eat with you, sir?" The old man's lips trembled before he managed to whisper, I would be honored." In that instant, the luxury restaurant, so proud of its status, so full of arrogance, was silenced by a 10-year-old boy. And you, what would you have done in Ethan's place? Would you have stayed quiet like the adults, or found the courage to stand up? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story has already touched you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because the next part of this story will show you just how powerful one act of kindness can be. The restaurant remained frozen in disbelief. A 10-year-old boy sitting beside an old man everyone else had mocked had shifted the energy of the entire room. The whispers died down, the laughter dissolved into silence, and suddenly the glittering chandeliers and polished marble floors seemed less important than the sight of a child choosing compassion over conformity. Walter, still trembling, tried to steady his hands on the edge of the table. His watery eyes darted around the room as if expecting someone to order Ethan back to his family. But the boy didn't move. He sat tall in his chair, small compared to the grandeur of the room, but unshakable in his decision. Ethan raised his hand, catching the attention of a passing waiter. His voice was clear, cutting through the uneasy silence. "Excuse me, can I have the same dish he ordered, please?" The waiter froze, unsure how to respond. Moments ago, he had treated Walter with disdain, but now a child was publicly holding him accountable. The other diners watched, their gazes heavy with judgment, not at Walter anymore, but at themselves. The waiter nodded stiffly. "Of course, young sir." His voice cracked slightly as he hurried away. Michael and Caroline sat at their table in shock. Caroline covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes glistening with a mixture of pride and fear. Michael, however, shifted uncomfortably, his face red. He was a man who had built his reputation on appearances, always careful about how others saw him. To have his son disrupt the entire dining room felt unbearable. But deep inside, even he couldn't deny that Ethan had done what no adult there had the courage to do. Across the room, the group of young men who had been the loudest in mocking Walter exchanged uneasy glances. One of them attempted to laugh again, but it came out hollow, unsupported by the others. The shame was settling in, heavier than the crystal wine glasses on their table. Walter turned toward Ethan, his voice fragile. "You didn't have to do that, son. People might laugh at you too." Ethan shook his head firmly. "Let them. They should be ashamed, not you." The words, simple yet piercing, carried across the dining room. Some guests looked away, embarrassed. Others lowered their eyes to their plates, unable to face the truth a child had spoken aloud. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere shifted. Where there had been cruelty, now there was discomfort and self-reflection. Couples whispered apologies under their breath, families exchanged awkward glances, and even the pianist's music softened into something mournful, as though reflecting the gravity of the moment. When the waiter returned, he placed a second bowl of soup and a slice of bread in front of Ethan. This time, his hands did not tremble with irritation, but with humility. He leaned slightly toward Walter and said, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear, "I'm sorry, sir." Walter looked at him with surprise, then nodded gently. "Thank you." Ethan smiled as if nothing unusual had happened. He picked up his spoon and began to eat beside Walter, as though they had been friends for years. To him, this wasn't an act of rebellion. It was simply what felt right. But for Walter, it was a revelation. For months, perhaps years, he had carried the weight of invisibility. He was used to being overlooked, ignored, dismissed as nothing more than a burden to society. Yet here, in one of the most exclusive restaurants in Chicago, a child had chosen to see him, not as an intruder, not as a nuisance, but as a human being. The room remained hushed, the tension thick but fragile. Some customers quietly motioned for the check, suddenly uncomfortable with staying after what had transpired. Others lingered, as if afraid to leave before understanding the full meaning of what they had witnessed. At the Thompson table, Michael finally broke the silence. His voice was low, edged with conflict. "Caroline, what do we do? Everyone's watching us." Caroline glanced at her husband, then back at their son across the room. Her reply was steady. "We let him be. Tonight he's teaching us something we forgot." Michael swallowed hard, feeling the truth in her words. Meanwhile, Ethan leaned closer to Walter. "What's your name, sir?" The old man blinked in surprise, as if no one had asked him that in years. "Walter," he said softly. "Walter Jameson." Ethan grinned. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Walter. I'm Ethan." Walter's lips trembled as he smiled back. "It's an honor, Ethan." Those simple introductions, names exchanged in a sea of judgment, were more powerful than any apology the crowd could have offered. The group of young men who had mocked Walter earlier stood up abruptly. One of them, his voice quieter than before, muttered, "Let's get out of here." They left in a hurry, their arrogance shattered, leaving behind only the echo of their cowardice. Other diners began to speak in low voices, but this time it wasn't ridicule. It was admiration. "Can you believe that boy?" whispered a woman in pearls. 10 years old and braver than any of us." Ethan's father watched from across the room, his chest heavy. For years he had taught Ethan to be polite, to behave, to blend in when necessary. But tonight, his son had chosen something greater than politeness. Integrity. And Michael realized, painfully, that his son had shown more strength than he himself possessed. Walter, now more relaxed, picked up his spoon and ate slowly. He no longer felt invisible. Every bite of soup carried with it the weight of dignity restored. Ethan's presence at his side turned the humiliation into something else, something powerful. The pianist, who had remained silent since Ethan's gesture, finally began to play again. This time it was not jazz or background music. It was "What a Wonderful World," soft and deliberate, each note hanging in the air like a reminder of what had just happened. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As the melody filled the room, Walter whispered, "You've given me more than company tonight, Ethan. You've given me hope." The boy smiled, unconcerned with the stares around them. "Everyone deserves respect," he said simply. The weight of his words settled over the room once again. This time, there was no laughter, no whispers, just silence, broken only by the soft music. For the first time in a long while, Walter felt that the world had not forgotten him. And for everyone else in the restaurant, the world suddenly seemed a little less shallow, a little more honest, because of a boy who refused to stay silent. The night was far from over, but already the lesson was clear. Dignity doesn't come from wealth, and respect isn't measured by clothing or money. Sometimes it takes the smallest voice to remind everyone of the biggest truths. As the minutes slipped by, the luxury restaurant transformed into a place of reflection rather than status. People who had once competed over who ordered the finest wine or the most expensive entree now found themselves glancing at the old man and the child seated together, realizing how shallow their priorities seemed in comparison. Walter ate slowly, savoring each spoonful not just for the taste but for the dignity that accompanied it. For years, he had carried the weight of being overlooked, brushed aside by a society that no longer valued men like him. And now, in the most unlikely of places, his humanity had been restored. Not by an adult with authority, not by a leader with influence, but by a boy with nothing to lose but everything to give. At his family's table, Ethan's mother Caroline dabbed her eyes with her napkin. She could hardly look away from her son, her heart swelling with pride. Her husband, Michael, however, sat rigid, his jaw tight. Every part of him screamed discomfort. He hated attention, hated disruption. Yet there was no denying the truth gnawing at him. His son had done the right thing. The waiter returned quietly, refilling Walter's water glass with a new respect. Unlike earlier, his movements were careful, deliberate. He glanced briefly at Ethan and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, as though to thank the boy for reminding him of what his job really meant. For the first time that evening, Walter didn't feel like an inconvenience. The other customers tried to return to their meals, but the mood had shifted. Conversations became hushed, stripped of the arrogance that had filled the air earlier. A woman in pearls leaned across her table and whispered to her husband, "That boy has more backbone than half the city's politicians." Near the back, an older couple, dressed plainly compared to the rest, watched silently, their faces lit with admiration. The man turned to his wife and said, "Makes you wonder when we all forgot how to act like decent people." Meanwhile, Ethan focused only on Walter. He asked simple questions about his name, his favorite foods, whether he had family. Walter answered with hesitation at first, but soon his words began to flow, like a dam finally giving way. He told Ethan about his years as a construction worker, about the bridges and schools he had helped build. His voice grew steadier as he recounted the pride he once felt in contributing to the city's growth. Ethan listened intently, nodding at each story. To him, Walter wasn't just an old man in worn-out clothes. He was a builder, someone who had shaped the very world they lived in. And the fact that others couldn't see that filled Ethan with even more determination to stay by his side. When Walter paused, his eyes distant, Ethan asked softly, "Do you ever feel invisible?" The question caught Walter off guard. His throat tightened as he nodded. "Most days, yes. People look right through me, like I'm a ghost that doesn't belong anywhere." Ethan's small hand reached across the table and rested on Walter's. "You're not invisible to me," he said firmly. Walter swallowed hard, unable to respond. His eyes brimmed with tears, but this time they weren't born of humiliation. They were born of relief. Across the room, a businessman in a tailored suit stood abruptly, pushing back his chair. He cleared his throat, drawing the attention of several tables. "Excuse me," he said awkwardly, his voice loud enough to carry. I want to say I was wrong. I shouldn't have laughed earlier. That was shameful." The admission startled the room. His wife tugged at his sleeve, urging him to sit, but he shook his head. "No, people need to hear this. We all laughed, or we all looked away, and it took a child to show us we were cowards." His face flushed, but his eyes were steady. "I hope we all remember this night." A murmur rippled across the restaurant. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but the message had landed. The mirror Ethan had held up was too clear to ignore. Michael exhaled sharply, pressing his hands to his face. "My God," he whispered. For the first time, the weight of his son's actions hit him fully. He had been so worried about appearances that he had almost missed the lesson right in front of him. Caroline touched his arm gently. "He's braver than we ever were." At Walter's table, the food was nearly gone, but the bond between him and Ethan had only grown. The boy chattered about school, about his love for drawing, about the dog he wished he could have. Walter listened, smiling faintly, his heart lighter than it had been in years. For once, he felt seen not as a burden, but as a friend. The pianist, still playing What a Wonderful World, slowed the tempo, as if intentionally framing the scene. Diners closed their eyes for a moment, letting the melody wash over them. It wasn't just background music anymore. It was the soundtrack of a night that no one in that room would forget. As the final notes hung in the air, Walter looked around the restaurant. For the first time since he had walked through those gilded doors, he felt no shame. He sat taller, his chest lifted. The cruel whispers had been replaced by a quiet respect, and though he knew it wouldn't erase years of being ignored, it was a start. Ethan, noticing the change in his posture, grinned. "See? I told you. You don't deserve to be laughed at. You deserve respect." Walter chuckled softly. "You're a wise little man, Ethan. Wiser than most people twice your age." Ethan shrugged as though it were nothing. "My mom says respect is free. People just forget to give it." Walter squeezed the boy's hand gently, his heart aching in the best way. "Don't ever forget that, son. The world needs more people like you." In the corner, the young men who had mocked Walter earlier reappeared, their coats slung over their shoulders. One of them hesitated, then walked toward the table. He stopped a few feet away, shifting nervously. "Sir," he said awkwardly, avoiding Walter's eyes. I'm sorry. We were wrong." Walter studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "It takes courage to admit that. Thank you." The young man nodded quickly and left, his face burning with shame. But perhaps, somewhere inside, a lesson had been planted. The room, once filled with cruelty, was now heavy with humility. And as the evening wore on, Ethan remained by Walter's side, his presence like a shield against the world's harshness. For Walter, that night would not just be a dinner, it would be the night dignity returned. The restaurant had shifted into something unrecognizable from the place Walter had first entered. Hours earlier, it had been a temple of vanity. Fine suits, glistening jewelry, conversations about deals and promotions. Now, though, the air was different. Every laugh that had once cut through Walter's dignity had been replaced by a thick awareness that they had all been part of something ugly. As Walter finished the last bites of his meal, he leaned back in his chair, still marveling at the boy beside him. Ethan hadn't touched much of his own plate. He wasn't there for the food. He was there for the man who needed him. His mother Caroline watched from across the room, her chest tightening with emotion. She could see her son was changing a life, and she could see her son was also being changed in return. The waiter approached once more, this time carrying 2 small dishes of dessert. He placed one in front of Walter and one in front of Ethan, bowing slightly. "On the house," he murmured, his voice stripped of the arrogance it had carried earlier. Walter gave a polite nod, and Ethan smiled brightly, thanking him. Walter took a small spoonful of the dessert, something rich and delicate, the kind of treat he had only ever seen in glass cases behind bakery counters. He shook his head, chuckling softly. "Never thought I'd eat something like this in my life." Ethan nudged him with a grin. "Guess it's about time, huh?" For a moment, the boy's innocence washed away the years of rejection Walter had carried. That spoonful wasn't just sweetness on his tongue. It was proof that dignity could be restored, even when least expected. When the plates were cleared, Walter pushed back his chair, intending to leave quietly. But as he stood, so did Ethan. The boy reached for his hand, lacing his small fingers through Walter's rough, calloused ones. Together they walked across the polished floor toward the exit. And then something happened that would stay with everyone in the room for years. The applause began softly, one pair of hands clapping from the back of the restaurant. Then another joined, and another, until the sound grew into a wave that filled the room. Diners who had laughed, diners who had looked away, even the ones who had whispered cruel jokes. Every one of them now stood, clapping for the old man who had walked in alone but was leaving with dignity. Walter froze, stunned. His chest tightened as tears blurred his vision. He looked down at Ethan, who simply squeezed his hand and whispered, "See? They get it now." Walter tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. All he managed was a trembling nod. Michael and Caroline stood as well, their hands meeting in applause for both the boy and the man. Michael's face was red, Not with shame this time, but with pride. Pride in his son for having the courage he himself had lacked. Caroline brushed a tear from her cheek, whispering to herself, "That's my boy." Walter, overwhelmed, finally turned back to the crowd. His voice was soft, but the room had gone silent again, and every word carried. "I don't need your applause," he said, his tone steady. "All I ever wanted was respect. Tonight I found it. Not from all of you, but from him." He pointed gently to Ethan. "This boy reminded me, and maybe reminded you, that we don't stop being human when we get old." The room stood motionless. Some bowed their heads in guilt, others nodded in agreement, but no one dared interrupt. Walter turned again and continued toward the door. With each step, Ethan stayed at his side, their hands still joined. The boy's small frame was a striking contrast to the older man's bent shoulders, yet together they seemed unshakable. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain on the pavement. Walter stopped on the sidewalk, breathing deeply. For the first time in a long while, he felt alive, not as a ghost on the edge of society, but as a man with worth. Ethan looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are you okay?" Walter let out a shaky laugh. "Better than okay, son. Tonight, you gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" Ethan asked. "My dignity," Walter whispered, "and my hope." The boy smiled, squeezing his hand once more before letting go. His parents approached from behind, both quiet, both humbled. Michael cleared his throat, struggling to find words. "Sir," he said awkwardly, I owe you an apology, too, for sitting there, doing nothing." Walter shook his head kindly. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe your son your pride. He's braver than most men I've met." Michael swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, and for the first time in years, the father felt like he had something to learn from his child. The family said their goodbyes, and Walter walked off into the night, his steps lighter than when he'd arrived. He didn't know where tomorrow would take him, but he knew tonight had given him back a piece of his soul. Back in the car, Caroline wrapped her arms around Ethan. "You have no idea how proud I am of you," she whispered. Ethan shrugged, embarrassed by the attention. "I just did what anyone should do," he replied simply. But everyone knew better. Not everyone would have done it. Not everyone had. It had taken a boy to remind a room full of adults what true humanity looked like. As the car drove away, Ethan leaned his forehead against the window, watching the lights of the city blur past. Somewhere in that city, Walter was walking home with his head high, and Ethan smiled, knowing that one small act of courage had changed everything. And you, watching this, what would you have done? Would you have laughed, stayed silent, or stood up like Ethan? The choice seems small, but it defines who we are. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it so more people remember that respect and dignity never go out of style.